The story is told of a philosophy student who took a job at Trader Joe's during the summer. And on his first day, somebody approaches him with cash in hand. He wants to pay cash. So he processes the payment, and the man says to him, "Can I please have my change?" So the philosophy student looks him deep in the eyes and says, "Change must come from within." So on the night of the Seder and the night of Pesach, we all want to experience change. But indeed, change must come from within. And if we look at each step of the Seder, we will notice how each step of the Seder provides us with another tool and another trick in our journey of freedom to achieve freedom from the limitations that Mitzrayim represents, that Egypt represents in our lives. So let's begin. We begin the Seder with Kadesh. Kadesh is when we pour the wine and sanctify the day. But Kadesh actually also means to prepare. Because if you think about it, the time leading up to the Passover Seder is very stressful. We're cleaning, we're cooking, families coming, lots to prepare. And if we fail to get into the zone properly, we can completely miss the whole night of Pesach, thinking about all the things that we did do, we didn't do, we should have done. So we begin the Seder with Kadesh, prepare, get into that zone, get into the space where we can enjoy and relish the night of Pesach. Okay. The second step is urchatz. Here we get up and we wash our hands to dip the vegetable in salt water. The laws of washing our hands in Jewish law are quite intricate. And one of the things that is stressed in Jewish law is that in order for our hands to become pure by washing them, there needs to be nothing interrupting between the water and our hands. They need to be completely clean. Which basically means that if we want to purify ourselves, if we want to change ourselves, we need to make sure that there's nothing interrupting between us and that goal of purity that we want to achieve. What does that mean? Perhaps old habits, things that hold us back from change because we're just too accustomed to them. So the lesson of urchatz is, if we want to proceed in our journey of freedom, we need to remove some of those impurities, those things that hold us back, and realize and locate what's holding us back so we can move forward. Kadesh, urchatz, karpas. We're now at the third step of the Seder, and at this point we are dipping the vegetable into salt water. Why do we do that? To recall the back-breaking labor that the Jews had in Egypt. What is back-breaking labor? What's the hardest form of labor? Well, schlepping, carrying heavy things is probably difficult. But if it has a goal, if it has a purpose, well, then it's not so bad. The worst type of labor, says Maimonides, is a labor that has no purpose at all, is something which just doesn't get you anywhere. It's just mindless. It just goes on and on. Same thing in our lives. We could have a good job, make a lot of money, and have good careers. But if there's no purpose, if there's no end goal, if there's no higher purpose in our lives can feel very frustrating and useless. We need to think to ourselves, do we have that higher purpose? What is our goal? And that's another step, an important step in our journey of freedom. Okay, yachatz. At this point, we split the middle matzah in half. Splitting the middle matzah reminds us of another time that something split during the Exodus, which was the splitting of the sea. The splitting of the sea in Kabbalistic thought is the idea of the sea coming apart, meaning the world is divided up by land and sea, and the land has the people on the land and the creatures of the land. They live almost independently from their source of life. So they walk around and we eat, we drink, but we walk around as independent beings, whereas the creatures of the sea, the fish swim around in the ocean, and it's clear that if you take the fish out of the ocean, they're no longer going to be able to survive. Those two types of existence, that which a creature which is living within its source of life, and land creatures which live kind of independently from their source of life, that represents two types of realities. There is the reality that we experience, which is the one of that we're independent beings. We live our lives, and we exist because we exist. And doesn't seem like we're connected to any higher source of life. But the creatures of the sea bring out a different reality, that which is the true reality, which is that we are constantly connected to our source of life. Just like the fish in the sea, if they would be disconnected from the water, they would die. So to us, we constantly are connected and being revitalized by our source of life, which is God. And so an important step of freedom is being in touch with that reality of our lives, which is that God is constantly keeping us alive and keeping us going, and that's really the true source of life. Okay, we move on. Karpas, Yachatz, Magid. So this is where the kids start turning the pages and seeing many more pages of Magid are left. We tell the story of Pesach. Now it's interesting that the Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation of the word Vayaged, which is a similar term of Magid, in the Torah, he translates it as Vichavi, which means to show. That Vayagid, even though it means to tell, he translates it as to show. Because really, the truest and most perfect lesson one can give to others is to lead by example. And so we might find ourselves frustrated by trying to guide our children, guide our families, guide our communities in the way we want to, but the lesson of the Haggadah of Magid is actually the way to tell the story, to change others, or even to change ourselves, is to lead by example, which is the Aramaic insight into the word Magid. Okay, Magid is finished. We've said the whole story, and now we move on to Rachza. So now we're washing our hands, moving on to the meal, the matzah, and the meal that we're going to have after Magid. So in other words, this represents the transition from the holy to the mundane. We've just spoken so much, told the story, very spiritual, and now we're heading into the physical, the eating the matzah, the eating the meal. This transition from the holy to the mundane, in order for us to preserve the holiness into the rest of our lives, we need to have moments like Rachza, like washing our hands, when we purify ourselves. So this might mean a Shabbat. Shabbat for many people is that time to retain the holiness in their lives by having this bubble where they separate themselves one day of the week and you tune in to what we know to be true, to holiness. So we all need to have moments of Rachza, moments when we're transitioning, when we have both of those things in our lives, the holy and the mundane, to have moments of holiness in our lives, whether it's a time in the synagogue, a time to study, Shabbat, whatever it is. We need to have those moments when we are Rachza, when we wash our hands, we're able to purify ourselves and be able to go back into the mundane with a proper focus. Okay, we've washed our hands. Now we're going to eat the matzah, motzi matzah. Motzi and matzah, those are two steps. We're going to do them together. The matzah is called the bread of our faith. Eating matzah means we are internalizing our faith. The Talmud tells of an interesting kind of issue of a person who goes to rob a home. He's a thief, he's a robber. And he's inside the home taking what he wants, and all of a sudden he hears noise. And he fears that the owner of the home is about to find him. And he starts praying to God, and he says, God, please get me out of this. Let me be successful in my thievery, that the owner shouldn't come and catch me. And you think about it, this is a person who's going against God's will. He's stealing, and yet he's asking God for a blessing. So you could have a person whose faith in God is there, but it's somehow up in the clouds. It's not real. It's not grounded. It doesn't affect his life. So eating the matzah means that our faith becomes internalized, that it actually means something to us, that it affects our day to day. That's what we're trying to accomplish on Pesach. We're trying to take our faith and make it something which affects our day-to-day lives. Okay, motzi matzah, we've eaten the matzah. Now we move on to morer. Morer means bitterness. And of course, we're remembering the bitterness that we experienced in Egypt. But there's an interesting point pointed out by the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe of Lubavitch. And he says that morer means bitterness. It's good to be bitter. Bitterness is not necessarily a bad thing. Sadness is a bad thing. So when we experience hard times in our lives, setbacks, it's not a bad thing to be bitter about them, because bitterness just means that we're upset with the reality that we're in and we want it to change. Sadness, depression, that is a mode of existence which doesn't lend itself to any growth. Bitterness, that's okay. Bitterness means I'm not happy with this and I want it to change. I'm going to work to change it. So the proper approach to negative things in our lives, downsets, down times in our lives and we're not happy with ourselves, is to bounce back and be bitter about it and say, how can I do better next time? Okay, that's the maror. Maror represents the difficult things, times in our lives. Now we move on to the korech. Korech is the sandwich where we take the matzah and the maror and we bring them together. And that represents the matzah, the faith, as we said before, and the maror, the difficult times in our lives. When we make a sandwich out of that, we're saying the message is that we're using our faith to counteract the bitter times in our lives. We're using our faith to remember that those difficult times in our lives are not happening independently in a vacuum, but actually they have a purpose. And they're actually going to bring us to a place which is better than we were before. Sometimes it's difficult to appreciate that in the moment. But what we do on the Seder night is we take in this faith and we remember that all that God does to us is for the good. And the maror, the bitter times, will have a happy ending as well. Okay, maror, koirach, shulchan aruch. So now we move on to the meal. And if you have any space, after all that matzah, now we have the meal. And the meal ends with an egg dipped in salt water, which is obviously not a delicacy. It's something which says to us, we're still in mourning. Even though we're celebrating freedom, but we're still in mourning because the Beit HaMikdash, the final redemption, has not come. And that's a lesson to us in our journey of achieving freedom, that even though we might be so comfortable and life might be so good and everything's great, we need to remember that the best is yet to come, and not to get too comfortable in our times in exile, but to remember that after all the good stuff, a delicious meal, it ends with an egg in salt water, because really the best is yet to come. The final redemption will be the best time for the Jewish people. Okay, we move on to tzafon. Tzafon is when we eat the afikomen. Now the afikomen is wrapped in a bag. It's meant to be wrapped up that way because that was how the Jews left Egypt, with their matzah wrapped up in a bag, hurrying out of Egypt. And Hasidic thought expands on this idea of how the Jews ran away from Egypt. Why did they have to run away? Surely the plagues had decimated Egypt. They could have walked out, they could have strolled out, nobody would have stopped them. So why did they have to run out? And Hasidic thought explains that they ran out because, in a spiritual sense, the Jewish people were very vulnerable. They needed to run away because if they would stay a moment longer in Egypt, they could possibly get sucked into the negative forces of Egypt. And so they had to run away, they had to get out of the bad situation. And the lesson for us in our journey of redemption is the same. That if we find ourselves going through a cycle which is damaging to us, we need to drop it all and run and look for a safe place. Look for a source of healing, of comfort, which will undo all that. So take a good stock at your life and think, is there something in my life which is damaging me, which is hurting me, which is not letting me grow? And run away from that and leave that all behind. Beirach. We move on to the next step where we bless Hashem. We thank God for the food that we just ate. And obviously in our lives, in our journey of redemption, it is the idea of thankfulness, of thanking God for the goodness that we have in our lives. With all the struggles that we have so much goodness, and it's important to be thankful and pay attention to all the blessings that we have. Finally, we say Hallel, we praise God. And at the beginning of that step, we go and we open the door for Elijah the prophet. And opening the door for Elijah, we ask for whatever we want. The possibilities are endless. And the lesson for a person in his journey is that don't keep yourself too rigid. Don't make yourself too small. Don't think that the possibilities and the dreams, don't limit them. You have endless potential. The possibilities are endless. And you can accomplish whatever you want if you only set yourself and your mind to it. And finally, Hallel ends with Nirtzah. Nirtzah is really not much of a step at all. The Seder is finished and we are now accepted. The Seder is, after all we've done to prepare, we've been accepted. And the idea is that after all of our work, we try hard, we work hard in this world, but we need to remember that ultimately the blessings come from God. And that is a reminder, an important reminder, to never lose sight, never get too stuck into the amount of work that we put in to invest ourselves too much, because ultimately, if it's the right thing and it's going to be good for us, God will provide the blessings at the end. And that's what's being brought out in Nirtzah. We finish off the Seder and we say, God, we've done our part, now it's your turn to give back. And it's the same message for our lives. We do our part and we tell God, now it's your turn to repay the work that we've done, because we recognize that the blessings come from God. So that's the 15 steps of the Seder, and I wish you a very happy Pesach, using these messages to achieve a true freedom this Pesach.